I wanted to start this afternoon with a question for all of you that you'll see up on this slide. What do these three words, all of which begin with the letter E, have in common? Earthsea, Elendil, and Eragon. Some of you might know the answer. Some of you may think you know. Maybe you vaguely remember having read something that had to do with these three names. But a lot of what I want to say today is linked to these three names, because each of these refers to a set of books. Earthsea is a world that was created by the writer Ursula Le Guin. It started off as a trilogy, but it grew quite rapidly into a whole series of books and short stories centered around this land that had dragons in it and wizards and other forms of magic. Elendil, some of you will remember, is the father of Eragon, the father of the king who returns in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And there again we have a world that is characterized by dragons and wizards and other forms of magic, as well as simple folk like hobbits. And then finally, in the E that you see third on this list is the E of Eragon, right? Eragon, who is a young dragon rider, born after many years of there being no dragon riders in a world called Alagacia. Now, you might be wondering, why do I talk about these things today? Part of it is that times of crisis give a lot of us time to read. When we are at home working, we can't be doing that all the time, and we therefore have more time, I think, to indulge in reading and exploration of worlds. And I was rediscovering many of these worlds for the second time as I went through the recent crisis. But much more importantly, what I love about these three sets of books, right, and the fact that all of them are involved with new worlds being created, is that in each of them, there is a particularly interesting quality. In Earthsea, there is a language called the Old Tongue, the old language in which the world got created and from which everything received their names. In Middle-earth, for Tolkien, we also have the language called Elvish, which the ancient people speak. And in the world of Alagacia, we have a world which speaks something called the ancient language. Now, what's really interesting about each of these is that you cannot lie in any of these languages. All of them are known as the true speech. And it is impossible because anything said in the true speech is by definition true. So it is impossible to lie or perform an act of deceit in these languages. And what's really interesting is that the names that people possess, the true names, not just the names and labels that they happen to be given by others, but the true names of each person, the true names of fire, of rocks, of the sea, of wind, of the earth itself. Each of these is given in the old language. It's given in Elvish, it's given in the old tongue of Earthsea, it's given in the ancient language of Alagacia and the world of Eragon. Now, why is this interesting? Because in Ursula Le Guin's books, as I think applies in the rest of them, when we control the name of something, we control the thing itself. And therefore, spellcasters who want to cast a spell of fire will say the ancient name fire and then be able to cast a spell with it. Or if they want to conjure up a wind, they will say the name wind in the ancient language and conjure that up. Now, this is all from worlds that are far away and worlds that are distant from us. But even in the world we live in many cultures, including the Abrahamic religions, names matter. One of the first things that Adam does as the first man in the biblical tradition is he gives names to the cattle, to the birds of the air, to every beast of the field, to all things, in other words. And it is the act of naming that gives each of those things their unique identity. Why is this important for us? Because as we think about what the arts and humanities can do, I think a lot of it boils down to the act of naming. We are naming the complexity, we are naming the variety and subtlety and dynamism of all of life. And as we come up with good names, those are the names that stick and help us to understand the world around us a whole lot better. Now let's take an example of this that is very close to all of our hearts. How did we name this virus that is currently the source of so much crisis and anxiety and stress and nerves for everyone? We started out by calling it the Wuhan coronavirus. Why? Because it came from the Chinese city of Wuhan. Gradually, as it became a much more global phenomenon and many other countries started to have more cases than Wuhan city or China as a whole, people started to realize that they couldn't name it in that way. They needed to find other names. And so we started to call it the novel coronavirus 2019 or nCoV 2019, right, as a short form. Now, this is also interesting because what it suggests is that it's novel, it's new, but it's a coronavirus. We've known other coronaviruses before. SARS, right, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, was caused by a coronavirus. And this current virus that we face, therefore, is novel because it gives us new qualities and it is not one that we recognized before. But then people also realized that after a while, it was not so novel. When the virus didn't go away and it persisted and it stayed with us, we started to realize it wasn't so novel after all, and we needed to find a new name for it. And then the World Health Organization settled on COVID-19 as a formal name, right, to capture that it is a coronavirus. It happened in 2019, and therefore that is the current name that we have. But I do wonder, will this name last? Because what happens if, as it looks increasingly likely, COVID-19 is around for a very long time? What if it is also COVID-20 and COVID-21 and COVID-22? The names matter, and I think the fact that we haven't fully settled on a name that captures the full complexity of the whole situation we're in, captured by the virus, suggests that we haven't really fully understood it, and we therefore have not fully come to grips with the complexity of the phenomenon that we have to deal with here. And this is particularly important because, as we saw with the examples of the old language, to name is to find truth, right? And if we name something, we give it a quality of truth that helps us to recognize what it is and what it isn't. And some of the names that we've used to deal with COVID, I think also show us that there have been interesting dimensions in each of the names that illuminate as well as obfuscate certain aspects of the crisis we're in. Many people talk about COVID as a war, right? We talk about defeating the virus. We talk about quarantines and clamping down on the case numbers. We talk about flattening the curve. All of those are objects and metaphors of war. But that name, that war name for COVID, is not enough, because what we find is actually, when you think about it, who's being defeated here? Who is the enemy in this war? Some people refer to COVID as a journey. They say we have to take this journey together, and on that journey we will learn and we will acquire insights about what exactly this virus is. But even that is an inadequate name, right? Because a journey suggests that we know where we're going, that there is a destination somewhere, but maybe there isn't. Maybe there is just this constant traveling, a constant process, rather than any kind of arriving. And that becomes interesting because we also then can ask ourselves, who does the traveling and how do we do it? Are all of us traveling in the same way on this journey? Or do some of us travel in great comfort as we have to work from home and knuckle down to safe distancing measures, but others actually might experience this as trauma or distress? That journey is not the same for everyone, which suggests to me that the next image there, the name of an ecology, if you call COVID an ecology, then maybe that helps us understand it a bit better, because we see that it's part of a natural process of evolution in the world. We start to understand that actually there are these natural life rhythms at work in it, and maybe this is just the world's and the Earth's reaction to capitalism and climate change and many of the other stresses and pressures that we as humanity have put on it. But even that, I think, is not enough as a name, because what we see is that the ecology captures linkages amongst people, but in a very cold and impersonal way. In other ecologies, the lion eats the gazelle eats grass, and there is an order of things, right? A natural order. But I'm not sure that that's always the case with COVID, because there are some people who are suffering in the crisis, which suggests to us that they may not deserve it. They may be suffering because of no fault of their own. They may be deprived for certain reasons. They may not have access to as much of the internet as others do, and therefore working from home or staying distant from others becomes much more difficult for them. And I think we need to start understanding that COVID is also a community phenomenon. It's a community because all of us have moral relationships with those around us. And that name of community, therefore, captures something very different compared to the war, the journey, and the ecology names that have already been given to this crisis. I think that's important because if we accept that naming is a key part of what the humanities do, then actually we haven't done a good job yet of fully naming the complexity and range and depth of this whole phenomenon that all of us find ourselves in. What I wanted to do was also give you other examples of why naming matters. What are some of your favorite examples of a name where when you look at it, you feel this thrill go down your spine and think, yes, that is absolutely accurate. That represents the thing so well that it must be the true name of this object. Sometimes we get that, sometimes we don't. These, for me, have been examples where I've looked at them and thought, yes, this really captures a particular aspect of something. Better than, say, COVID as war or ecology or community even has captured for the virus. When Barack Obama talks about the audacity of hope, right, in his second part of his autobiography, I think that captured the name of a time. It was about being audacious, about having large dreams, but it was also audacity of hope. It wasn't anger, it wasn't frustration, it was hope. The fact that there is something to be optimistic about in the future. Even if we don't necessarily feel that way now, that captured the name and the tenor of a time. When Lee Kuan Yew, decided to title one of his books Hard Truths, that I think captured something as well, right? Hard, difficult aspects of things that we go through, and truths, right? Fundamental realities that we cannot run away from. And when you put them together, these hard truths capture both something about the phenomenon he's describing, as well as the times that he was in, and the broad challenges that a place like Singapore can face. Some time ago, I read a wonderful book about identities that all of us have by the philosopher Amartya Sen. And Amartya Sen described what he called plural monoculturalism. The fact that in some countries and societies, we may have many different ethnicities and religions, all coexisting, but they never interact with each other. So they're plural because they're all there in their diversity, but they are monocultural in that they never actually interact with each other. There isn't any kind of energy between them. That, I thought, captured a phenomenon that we want to be careful about, because diverse societies like Singapore and many other parts of the world probably don't want to be plural monocultures. They want to have interactions amongst the cultures and be truly multicultural. Thomas Hardy, in The Mayor of Casterbridge, describes human beings at one point as we fettered gods of the earth. That, for me, is another set of names that is just beautiful. It sends shivers down my spine whenever I read that novel again. The fettered gods of the earth are fettered in that we are chained, we're imprisoned, we don't have complete freedom, but we're gods of the earth. We have dominion and control over other things. We have an element of the divine in us, if you believe several religious traditions that believe that we are created in God's image. And that idea that we are therefore both fettered and gods at the same time is, for me, a truly accurate description of what humankind is like, and therefore the kinds of both struggles and opportunities that we have to deal with. The last two examples, let me start with Shakespeare first of all. One can't have a talk on humanities and the arts without at least mentioning Shakespeare briefly, I think. And when Shakespeare in Hamlet, right, characterized the condition of humanity in this dilemma of to be or not to be, I think he was naming the complexity of life as well, that we are often stuck in this existential struggle between an active life, to be fully ourselves, or not to be, right? To be alienated and fragmented from what we are. Both of those are key parts of the dichotomy that exists for all of humanity. And finally, I wanted to share two examples with you that are a bit more personal. And these are the titles of my poetry collections, because I wrote many of the poems and then struggled for the longest time with what to call each of the collections. The first title, Morning at Memory's Border, came to me when I was actually in Texas. I was at a writers' festival and I heard so much poetry around me that I think I finally was able to give a name to my own book. And I called it Morning at Memory's Border because I think of memory as a place. It has borders to it, and when morning comes, a lot of those delineations and those boundaries get lit. They are illuminated in ways that were not there in the dark of night. But each of the words matters as well, because I was writing a lot about mornings, about memory, and about borders, both physical and literal, as well as figurative ones. So put together, the name worked, both at the individual words level, as well as all of them working as a composite. Similarly with the other titles, second persons. I called the book that because each poem was written as a second-person poem, addressed to a you of some kind. Some of these were love letters to people, some were love letters to God, some were letters to myself, but all of them were written in the second person to a you of some form. But what was also interesting was that book was my second book, and it meant, therefore, that it was a second version of me. And the name, therefore, started to work on multiple levels. And I think these are quite critical ways of thinking about how we name things. Because when we get the name right, something falls into order about the world that we're in. And the more we try to do that, to get names correct, the more we'll be able to adjust to the kind of demands that the world has of us. I think my challenge that I would leave you with to end off the talk is to really ask yourself, what is your true name? What would your name be in the old tongue of Earthsea, or Elvish, or the ancient language of Alagacia? Because when we seek our true names, we start on this lifelong adventure that in some ways never ends, because maybe our true names also change and evolve along the way. Some of this is determined by the work we do, the vocations and the missions that we have. But most importantly, my favorite word for what I do is calling. A calling because I'm called to do public sector work or called to be a poet. And what is it that we call people? We call them by their names. So as you go about listening to the calling of your own name, what I hope you will find is that you hear it increasingly clearly over time, and that when you do find your true name, you find that your place in the world is truly well defined, and that you can start giving to others as much as you receive from them. Thank you very much for having me.